Okay, welcome everybody. Looks like we've got folks streaming in. Hi everybody on Zoom. Hey everybody on YouTube. We're gonna get started here just in a few. All right, let me get my windows together here. All right, thanks y'all. This is the final fermentology seminar for the summer. Thank you for joining us. And thank you for joining us at a different time as well, a little bit earlier in the day, or maybe earlier in the evening, or maybe first thing in the morning tomorrow, depending on where you're at. My name is Michelle Jewell. You've seen me 100 times by now, but I am the science communicator here at the Department of Applied Ecology at North Carolina State University, based in Raleigh, North Carolina. And this is the Fermentology mini seminar series. We've had talks from everybody, it seems like, in the fermentology community for the past year and a half. So if you're looking for any previous talks or you want to check them out, this is your first time tuning in, go ahead and head over to YouTube and you can type in fermentology and they'll all pop up. Today, we are going out with a bang. We're definitely saving the best for last. We have Aviaja Hauptmann, who's going to be joining us. She's a microbiologist. Just incredible talk that I've seen sneak previews of and seen the pictures, and she's going to be walking us through how the Inuit fermentation process has played a role in the past and potentially can play a role in the future as well when we talk about our foods. As always, if you have any questions, we are going to have a Q&A at the end of the talk. So if you're on YouTube, as you have questions, go ahead and type them in the chat and I'll be monitoring those. On Zoom, if you're joining us there, there's a little box called Q&A down at the bottom right-hand side. You go in there and type in your question as well. And then I'll be selecting some questions at the end and asking Aviaja. All right. Without any further ado, I will pass the baton over. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen so I can get started. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for letting me be part of this incredible series. I've been looking so much forward to this. So today I'm going to give, as brief as I can, an overview of Inuit fermentation practice from my perspective. And before I go into the fermentation practice, I just want to make sure that everyone knows what I'm talking about when I say Inuit. So we as Inuit, we are an indigenous population to the Arctic region. The Inuit live all the way in all of the Circumpolar region, all the way from Russia over Alaska and Canada, all the way to Giblik, Greenland, which is part of the Kingdom of Denmark. And the Inuit fermentations that I'm going to introduce today are all from Giblik, from Greenland. So I am from Greenland, and most of the ferments that I'll be presenting are from the west coast of Greenland. So the most basic thing one needs to know about the Inuit diet, not just the fermented foods, but the diet in general, is that it is animal sourced. So August Krogh, who's a Danish Nobel laureate, described the diet of the Eskimo as an extremely close analogy to those of the large carnivorous animals. And that is very true. That's also illustrated in this table that I've just brought here that shows the diet in 1885 on the east coast of Greenland that at the time resembled the original Inuit diet. And back then it was comprised of 45% protein energy and 55% fat energy. And that leaves 0% for carbohydrate energy, which means that there was essentially no plants in this diet. Maybe through a short period in the summertime, there had been some plants, but not enough to actually make up a lot of the energy in this diet. So this is a very strong contrast to what we today believe as being a healthy diet. What you see on the right-hand side is the Danish diet pyramid. So you could take the Inuit diet and then turn that diet pyramid upside down, because we've eaten basically just what's on top here and almost none of all of this at the bottom of the diet pyramid. And one of the things that is conventionally believed about an animal source diet is that it's not very varied. And it's as if we think about plants, like you see on the left-hand side here, there's this notion that you can eat the rainbow in colors in plants and you'll be healthy. And I believe it's because if we go into our supermarkets and we look at the vegetable aisle, we know instinctively, well, we see a lot of different colors. That gives us an impression of diversity. But also we know that these different fruits and vegetables, some have sweet taste, some have sour taste, some have bitter taste. And they all have different shapes and textures. So we instinctively know that plants can be diverse, but we don't think about animal source foods in the same way. But really an animal source food can be a very diverse diet. And I think especially if you look at the fermented foods from an animal source diet, you can be convinced that it can be a very diverse diet. Together with Fulbright student Auguste Finsel, we've been trailing through a lot of historical literature about Inuit fermented foods from Greenland. So I want to show a couple of tables that just sums up some of the fermented foods that we've come across. And some of these foods are still made today and some of them aren't. So the seal, the sea mammals, and in particular the seal, is sort of the cornerstone of the Inuit diet. And just within the seal, there's a diversity of fermented foods. You can ferment entire carcasses with the bowels left in them. I hope that the table is visible, but I'm not shadowing it. And these are quotes from historical literature, by the way. You can ferment the flesh or the entrails, the blood, the flippers, the blubber filled into bags made of seal stomachs. This one called Inuk is the blubber that has been filled into bags made of seal stomachs. And it gets this brown color on the outside because you put it in the sun before you leave it to ferment, and then it's pink on the inside. And then within the seals, there's a diversity of seals that you can ferment: the hooded seal, the bearded seal, the harp seal, the barked seal, or the bladdernose seal. And then there's the walrus, which is also still part of the Inuit fermented foods repertoire today. So this is an example from Circumpolar, which is the northernmost permanently populated place on Earth in Greenland. And you see here a barrel of wood standing on the shore. And then when you catch a walrus, you add to that batch of fermenting walrus on the inside. What you see here is like a huge walrus flipper. And then there's narwhal that you can also ferment, in particular the intestines, which I will come back to. And I wanted also to just show you some of this historical literature. And this is an example by Aviaja Hauptmann in what is called Melodies of Grönland from 1962. And Aviaja Hauptmann here is describing the use of seal in Greenland. So what he says is that to the Greenlanders, seal meat is a nourishing food. And then he goes on down here to describe the fermented versions. And it says, fermented is what I call the meat which the Greenlanders store away until it is half putrefied. Indeed, sometimes it is almost rotten and stinking, for it is rarely so bad that they have to throw it away completely. In order to bring it into this condition, they put the meat into blubber pits in summer and cover it with a little blubber. Or they leave the blubber on the meat, whereby it quickly becomes tender. In winter, however, the process is not so simple, for then the meat will usually freeze and thus be prevented from putrefying. So they have deep storage pits in the ground, to the deep parts of which the frost cannot get so readily. So a whole seal prepared in this fashion is to them the finest dish they can serve to outside visitors. So I really like this quote because it also tells us that while the explorers, European explorers or American explorers that came to the Arctic definitely preferred fresh meat or frozen meat, the Inuit would prefer the fermented variant over the fresh or the frozen, there could be a lot of different reasons, which is just it tastes better, but also its nutritional value could be part of this. And I find this very interesting. And just to show the last part of the table, so land mammals are also part of the fermentation practice, not so much the animals themselves, but their intestinal content. And then fish and shellfish, as an example here, also still made today, is a snow fermented cod. So in January, around January, in the capital area of Inuk, you can put cod, layers of cod, and then layers of snow, layers of cod, and layers of snow. And then you make your snow fermented cod. And you can do that for about 3-4 months until it gets too hot. And then there are a variety of birds also, of which some of it's the intestinal content that's eaten in a fermented state, or some versions it's the whole bird, like the little auk, which is made into what is called the Giblik. And I will be showing how a Giblik is made in this talk. And then there are also some birds of which the eggs are fermented. So one type of ferment from Greenland that I want to go through is gastrophagy, the eating of intestinal content and intestines. And what this picture shows is a drying narwhal intestine. So while this isn't considered strictly a fermented food, if you look here at the bottom of the narwhal intestine, you can see something sort of oozing out. And when you eat this, you have no doubt that there's some fermentation going on. So it's rinsed with seawater and fresh water, and then it's left to dry. And once it's dry, it looks like this. It gets extremely chewy. It's very difficult to bite through. And when you then cut it open, the inside looks like this, which is very sticky and very caramelly. And I always like to say that while it looks like caramel, it does not taste like caramel at all. It has an incredibly strong and irony, I guess, flavor like iron, like a lot of sea mammals do. So this is, while it's a dried food, but also it has some fermentation going on. And this is just an example where it's not the narwhal intestine, but a seal's intestine that's being dried. And this is usually used for soups, for instance, where it doesn't get chewy, but more like a rubbery texture. And then there's this one, which is the stomach content of the caribou. And maybe 10 years ago, you would be able to go down to the hunter's market and you could buy bags of this green stuff from the caribou stomach, but it's not very common today to eat it, but it used to be considered a delicacy. And Kai Birgit-Smith was an ethnographer in Greenland, described this as one of the most treasured vegetables that was acquired from the animal kingdom, this fermented and acidic content of the caribou gut. And just to present just a little bit of the microbial results that we've made, because we published on this particular food, I wanted to show you this figure here. And what you're seeing is the microbiota, the microbial composition on different pieces of dried caribou meat, because I was following the microbial composition through the drying process. But then we also included the stomach content, because this is also a food, and wanted to look into the microbiota on the stomach as a food. And what was interesting about the microbial content of the stomach is this yellow here, because it's not present in any of the other samples. There's some yellow up here, but it's actually a different yellow. And what this large fraction of yellow microbes are is Prevotella, and 70 different OTUs of Prevotella. And this was an interesting finding, because one thing that I realized when looking at this result is that if I had traveled back in time and gone to Greenland 300 years ago, so to this month, Greenland was colonized by Denmark exactly 300 years ago. If I had traveled back in time and met an original Inuit population in Greenland, and I had brought with me the modern diet pyramid, and I would have seen these people eat a lot of meat, and I would say, you probably need some whole grain to have a healthy gut microbiota. And I would have shared whole grain foods to them. I believe that we wouldn't have gotten the health benefit from those whole grains back then, because as we know, our gut microbiota adapts to the foods that we eat. And if you have a diet, as I showed in the beginning, with 0% carbohydrate energy, you would not have had prevotellus in your stomach probably, because you would not have been feeding those microbes that could live off the plant fiber. So when Inuit were eating plants, it would make a lot of sense to eat those high fiber plants in connection to microbes or together with microbes that can degrade these plants. And a fantastic way of doing that is to eat the stomach content of herbivores, and even to eat like coprophagia, eating the fecal matter of plant-eating animals, which is also has been part of the diet. So this would be a nice way to prepare for a summer where there might have been a little bit more plant material in the diet. Otherwise, you wouldn't have gotten a lot of energy out from that plant material. And then I want to show how to make the Giblik. The Giblik has been become quite famous, or maybe infamous, in fermentation circles. And the Giblik are fermented seabirds. And there's a very lovely art piece here by my friend Ida, showing a Giblik that we had the fortune to be able to experience being made in the very northern part of Greenland in Circumpolar. So Giblik are fermented seabirds, but different kinds of seabirds can be fermented. Most often it's this one, the little auk. And the little auk is a tiny bird. It's like the size of my hand. And they arrive in northern Greenland in May, and then they stick around for about 3 months where they breed. And that's why it also makes a lot of sense to preserve them for use later on the year, because they're there in such short amount of time. And to catch your Giblik, you use this particular net called the gashut. And a gashut is a very, it's almost 3 meters long, or a little bit over 3 meters long, and very bendy in its handle. And then you crawl up on the cliffside, high up on the cliffside, where the birds fly in and out of their nests. And then you catch between 300 and 600 of these birds, depending on the size of the sealskin that you want to stuff the birds into. And I want to show a very short video. We just tested this, and I realized that what I really wanted to show was actually the noise from the birds there. But at least you will be able to see how many birds there are when you sit there on the cliff. And then I hope we might be able to upload the video somewhere else so that you can hear the sound better, because the sound isn't very high on this one. So here we go. Just a sec. Just wanted to show really short clip here, but we can upload the full version somewhere. So the skies almost get black with the bird sometimes, and it is extremely noisy. It's a really incredible experience to see this. So once you've caught the birds that you need to put them in the shade. There's a very important primary rule in Inuit fermentation practice, and that is that the sun cannot see the food. So you have to leave the birds to cool down. They cannot be warm. They have to be the same temperature as the surroundings, which in Circumpolar can be in the summer times probably 0 to 5 degrees Celsius, and make sure that the sun does not see the food. And then once they've cooled down, you can stuff them into that seal skin from which you've taken the seal itself out, leaving just holes at the end. And then you start stuffing in those birds, and you squeeze out the air. You compress out the air really as much as you can. So even that in the end, you stand on top of the Giblik to make sure that all the air is pressed out. And then once you've stuffed it up, you sew it really nicely like this. And then you stuff any other holes that might be in the seal skin, you stuff with birds. And the bird here is not a little auk, because this is quite a big bird. As you can see, this is the gillimat. In Greenlandic, we call it appa. So you can make appa Giblik, or you can make the little auk appeljarsuk Giblik, depending on what birds you have in hand or what you want. So the Giblik that we followed was made from the bigger bird, the Eppa. And then in the end, you have this figure, which is the Giblik, the sealskin full of seabirds. And this is where this piece of artwork comes in, showing how the birds are lying in there, all pressed together. And then this is the pit in the ground. It's not buried very far down. It's a very shallow pit in the ground. And what you see over here is a data locker, because I had a data locker, a temperature locker inside the Giblik and also one outside. And then you cover all the sewed parts with seal blubber to prevent flies from laying eggs there. If they do lay eggs, it's okay. You can still eat the Giblik. You just brush off the eggs or the mites, but you prefer not to have them. And then you cover it with rocks. So this is what a Giblik looks like once it's done. And it has the most incredible view over the very northern part of Greenland. And in the end, once it's done, and that depends on the climate, depends on how much sun there was for that year. You have to go and you have to smell and use the aroma to determine whether or not the Giblik is done. And once it's done, it looks somewhat like this. And I really think that this is an incredibly beautiful food. And as I said in the beginning, it's become quite infamous. If you go to YouTube and you Google Giblik with a K, you can find this South Korean documentary about the Giblik, which is quite interesting. But as you can see, like grotesque and disgusting. And then this one, which is a Danish celebrity chef describing how sick he got from eating Giblik. There's sort of a very, like, it's viewed upon as an extreme type of food, but this doesn't really tell us why people make this food and why it's important, which is really what I would like to like a new narrative that I would like to promote around our fermented foods. And that brings me to the final fermented food that I want to show, the eider egg. So this is a fermented eider egg. The eider is also a seabird, sort of like a duck size, and it's a duck bird. And the eider eggs are also fermented in northern Greenland, a little bit similar to the Giblik, laid in these pits with rocks on top of them, but not in the seal skin. And of course, you have to be very careful when you put the rocks so that the eggs don't break. And after having experienced this food, I realized only months after that it's actually illegal in Greenland to collect the eider eggs, and it has been for a lot of years. So this food was a really interesting and rare encounter, and it has a really incredible flavor like cheese. And I was fascinated with the fact that these were illegal, because when I was there in northern Greenland, and as I said, it's the northernmost permanently populated place on Earth, we went to the grocery store. There's one store in town. The town has about, less than 60 inhabitants, 60 persons live there. We could buy grapes from Mexico, and we could buy kiwi from Chile. So I just, where these countries are, but Circumpolar is over here. And these foods have traveled literally across the planet to come to Circumpolar. And that to me is very important in Greenland, that we discuss what kind of food system we promote. Why we prefer having foods that have been imported across the planet, and then illegalize some of our local foods. And that's a discussion that we need to be having in Greenland, because what happens when we illegalize, for instance, fermented foods, is that our youth is not taught the preparation techniques. So we have knowledge disappearing. And when that happens, we know that there's an increased food safety risk from these foods, because the knowledge on how to prepare them traditionally is really what prevents food safety risks. And that makes people worry about these foods. And again, so this is the negative feedback loop, that youth has become alienated towards our fermented foods in Greenland and across Inuit lands. And then the knowledge disappears even more. So that's sort of a negative feedback loop that we risk when we illegalize some of these foods and we promote imported foods instead. And the inspiration for realizing all of these things come from ICC, which is the Inuit Circumpolar Council, who have done incredible work on food security and food sovereignty. And there's a quote in this report that exemplifies this really well. So the quote says, for example, increasing air temperatures are making it difficult to dry fish. Sometimes the fish cooks before it can dry. With rising temperatures, loss of ice cellars and permafrost, new ways of storing food have continued to be explored, such as drying fish within homes. However, the knowledge of some alternative practices is not being relied upon as heavily. For example, fermenting meat and fish is a good way to store food. It is also highly nutritious. This example demonstrates the importance of documenting our practices and continuing to teach our youth through doing so, that they will also be able to explore new ways of storing food in the future. So fermented foods definitely is viewed upon as something that could have a role in the future, but we really need to have a lot of knowledge to be able to do that safely and for that to be promoting of food security. So the Inuit Circumpolar Council also made this, this is our drum, the qilad. And what really quickly I wanted to say with this figure, other than just showing it because it's really beautiful, is that for Indigenous peoples and for Inuit as well, food sovereignty and food security are very tightly connected. And once we realize that, I think our fermented foods can go into a sort of a positive feedback loop instead. So if we promote our own food sovereignty or food self-determination, and we are able to have a resurgence of our fermented foods, we can increase the knowledge and understanding of these foods, which will promote food safety, and that will enable us to allow these very nutritious and locally available foods that connect us to land and to culture, and to allow them to be part of our food security. And as mentioned just before, food security and food sovereignty are very tightly connected to Indigenous peoples and people in general, of course. So I think I'm at a 30-minute mark about now, and I'll stop talking. And I very much hope that there will be some comments or questions so we can talk about this. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Aviaja. Yeah, I'll give people a few minutes here to collect their thoughts, throw it in the Q&A if they'd like to. Same here on YouTube. You can go ahead and throw your questions in the chat there too. I'm really fascinated personally by, oh, okay, no, we've got our first question in. So, okay, yeah, just explaining, Aviaja, a little bit more about what does it mean to have food sovereignty in general terms?
So that looks different to different peoples. The food sovereignty concept in academic terms is quite tightly connected to agriculture, but to Inuit, it's not, because our diet is non-agricultural. It is a hunter-gatherer's diet. So for Greenland, I can say that food sovereignty looks like what it would look like if we had it, because it's, at least it's my argument that we don't have it, is that resource management from the government would align with what hunters or people in the communities want, or that at least those two could collaborate on finding a balance between resource management and having like subsistence hunting. So right now we don't have that. There's a great disconnect between the formal food system that we push in Greenland. So in Greenland, our diet recommendations are exactly the same as the Scandinavian ones. We promote whole grains rather than seal meat. We also promote milk to children in a population where half of the population are lactose intolerant, rather than promoting dried fish that we eat, including their bones, that have higher content of calcium. So for me, food sovereignty is when we've actually acknowledged the strengths of our diet and incorporated those in the formal food system, and also where hunters and administrators collaborate on setting boundaries for how we use our resources.
Fascinating. Yeah. So there's so many strengths to that, right? Sustainability, not importing, from a climate change perspective, not flying kiwis halfway across the world to
all the
support.
way across, not halfway.
Yeah. No, yeah, you're right.
Across.
Yeah, of course, completely across the planet, in order to fulfill this kind of random food pyramid, which in itself is like very debated, right? Like it's not a strong thing. Anyhow, I'll get off my soapbox. More questions coming in. Tyler's curious. When eating these fermented foods, are there fermented condiments that go along with it, or is it just straight up the meat itself?
Yeah, a lot of it will have some blubber. So like the original condiment would be oil, like seal oil, which is also a fermented food, the iginna that I showed in the beginning. And a lot of our dried foods will be eaten with that oil. It's sort of like a piece of bread with olive oil that you will get in a restaurant or in Italy. So we would have a dried fish with the seal oil. But today, like the modern traditional diet that we have, we'll be using almate that people might know as like MSG, monosodium glutamate, as a condiment to these foods.
How does seal oil compare to like an olive oil? Is it very similar, or is it quite? No,
it's very distinct, but it's one of those Inuit fermented foods that's not difficult to like for people who have not grown up with these foods, because these are definitely some of the more strongly acquired tastes, but fermented seal oil is delicious. It really is. And I have an ongoing collaboration with the restaurant Alchemist in Copenhagen around the seal oil, because it is really a delicious thing. Like all of these other foods, but this one is easier for people to get to know.
Right. Coming to a restaurant near you soon, right?
Yeah, maybe.
Questions about kiviak. How is it served or eaten? Is there prep involved along with it?
No. You once it's done, once it's done, you put it in the freezer, and then it can last forever once it's in your freezer. And then it's usually used for celebrations like birthdays or Christmas. And so you take them out of the freezer, and then you usually would sit on the floor. That has a certain meaning to people, to sit on the floor, and then you eat it there just as it is. So the skin comes off really easily, and then you can eat it like that.
Nice. Okay. The questions are coming thick and fast now. I'm going to go over to YouTube here. Kitty's got a question. Comparing kind of similar systems here. She was saying that in a Yupik village in the Bering Sea, there were split walrus hanging on drying racks. And the hunters referred to this as fermenting, not drying. Is that similar to the dried intestines you showed?
Could be. I think so. That would depend a lot on the climate, probably. So northern Greenland is extremely dry. And from the assessments that I've done just on drying fish and drying caribou and muskox, I can see that because of the humidity being so low, and in the summertime the heat being comparably high, the foods will dry before they ferment. But maybe in Yupik areas, maybe the humidity is different, so there can actually be a fermentation before the drying. And I've heard that before, but not in Greenland. You would not call the dried things that you hang up, you wouldn't be calling them fermenting. Okay. And for the narwhal's intestine, it's because it's closed, right? It's a tube, so the dryness cannot get in before there's actually some fermentation going on. And there's such a high microbial load there.
Yeah, so that's a great segue to Daniel's question here. Do we know about the microbiota operating in these systems like kiviak and whatnot? Has that been analyzed yet?
I'm working on it as we speak. Yeah, and my collaborator Maria Marco and some of her team have also looked into some fermented foods from northern Canada, but none of it has been published yet.
Okay, Fran's curious too. Would consuming stomach contents of herbivores, or maybe even the narwhal that we had, would they provide water-soluble vitamins like vitamin C?
So it's the caribou stomach content does not actually have a lot of vitamin C, a surprisingly low amounts of vitamin C. But what the fermentation practice could do is it can preserve vitamin C in whatever foods you stuff into it. So in Greenland, we would eat usually, and that's also still done today, when you hunt a caribou, you take out the liver, which is high in vitamin C. And vitamin C is very volatile. It will disappear out of foods really quickly. And being a very critical vitamin to get in the Arctic, you would need to find a way to preserve it. So you take the liver, you cut it up in small pieces, and you stuff that into the caribou stomach, which has a low pH, and vitamin C preserves better at low pH. So you could actually preserve some of the vitamin C in the stomach content. And then cod roe, for instance, in some cases has been shown to have really high amounts of vitamin C, and that is fermented as well. And we'll figure that out, but maybe fermenting it will allow the vitamin C to be preserved for a longer time. So that's a really relevant question.
And Judy kind of got that one for you there. This came in from Anonymous. I wish you'd put your name on it. It's a great question. So they say, you mentioned that the majority of people in the area were lactose intolerant. And have there been any other health issues that have arisen from the colonization of the diet food availability in Greenland?
Also really great and important question. Yes. So that's the short answer. Yeah. We definitely have an epidemic of diabetes and obesity and everything that comes with that from promoting imported foods over our own foods. Right. Yeah. So coming from a diet that has almost no carbs, going to a diet where you rely on imported carbs, which means not a lot of fresh vegetables, but mostly preserved ones, definitely puts you in risk of having diabetes.
Gosh. Yeah, great. Everyone, thank you so much for your questions. Aviaja, thank you so much. I've been looking forward to your talk for so long. It's been in the discussion hallway of people chatting about how they can't wait to tune in. So thank you so much. For those of you who still have questions and maybe didn't want to put them in the chat, Aviaja, you had your slide up earlier that had some contact information for you. I'm sure you can find her online somewhere, Twitter, etc.
Thank you so much. I so appreciate being here, and I hope very much that the talk lived up to everyone's expectations.
Totally. Yeah. And before we close out, I'm just going to say a big thank you to everybody. So this is the last talk of the summer. We've been doing these for a year and a half on almost a weekly basis, and then we moved to every other week. We've had so many great speakers during this series, and even though this might be the end of the seminars live itself, it will live on as a project. As you well know, Rob discussed a few weeks ago some ideas that he's got coming out to keep this conversation going, but just in different formats as we all kind of change our lives up again. So thank you to all of you who have attended. I know some of you have actually seen every single talk, and I appreciate that. If you have any feedback at all on the series, you can email me directly. It comes straight to my inbox, appliedecology@ncsu.edu. I'd love to hear feedback, things you loved, things you wouldn't like in the future, etc. So thank you again, Aviaja, for closing us out, and I'll say goodbye to everyone.